Hi, my name is Laura Hall, and this is my PowerPoint on ancient Egypt and the Nile. Where was ancient Egypt? Ancient Egypt was very spread out, but the main parts to focus on are Upper and Lower Egypt. The delta, which is the triangle-shaped area at the opening of the Nile, is where Lower Egypt is located and where the Nile starts. A cataract is a waterfall or spot where water runs fast over rocks, and one cataract is shown by the arrow. These next few slides are just about Egypt in general, and later we'll get into the specific time periods of ancient Egypt. So, Egypt's innovations. It is believed that they created the first written language, although some scholars are willing to debate that. Their form of writing is very different from the form most commonly used today. They had pictures to represent sounds, whole words, or ideas. This written language is called hieroglyphs. Some other important innovations or contributions are the calendar they created, and it was based on the sun and the stars. They also studied arithmetic, geometry, and medicine. They were very ahead of their time in these subjects. They also had the first monotheistic ruler, named Akhenaton. And finally, they wrote on a paper-like substance called papyrus. And papyrus is actually a type of reed that grows along the Nile. Egyptian religion. Except for Akhenaton, Egyptians were pagans. They believed in many different gods. I only have some of the most popular gods here, but the sun was the symbol of the life cycle, and they believed that when the sun rose each day, that was like its birth, and when the sun set, it was like its death. The most important god was Ra. He was the sun god. Osiris was the god who taught Egyptians about farming and was responsible for the plants growing. Horus and Isis ruled the sky, and Egypt's religion was their way of explaining why things happened, especially with the unpredictable Nile. And this is common in most pagan religions. The civilizations used their gods to explain why there were earthquakes or why the plants would grow, and it just helped them understand what was happening. Egyptian government. The pharaoh is the ruler of ancient Egypt, and they decided just about everything about Egyptians' lives, and they made sure that their traditions didn't die out. They were believed to be a god in human form, and the rule of Egypt passed from one family member to another, and this is called a dynasty. The vizier is the next important person in Egyptian government, and the vizier carried out orders from the pharaoh and carried out the day-to-day activities that were not really important enough for the pharaoh to take care of. Then, of course, there were the peasants, and these are basically just the poor people who farmed the land. Uniting Egypt. Villages in the delta were called Lower Egypt, and the villages farther inland in the river valley were called Upper Egypt. And for a while the two kingdoms were separate, but in 3000 BC they were united. And this is really important because the world's first organized government was formed, and this government was able to survive for another 3,000 years. The Old Kingdom. This is also known as the Age of the Pyramids, and it lasted from 2625 BC to 2130 BC. A pyramid is a burial place for the dead, and a pyramid is basically for a pharaoh. But anyone wealthy enough could build their own tomb, as long as it never was larger than the pharaoh's tomb, and, well, very few people could actually afford to build their own tomb, so it wasn't that common. A mummy, which is a preserved body, was placed in the pyramid with anything they might need in the afterlife. And just a fun fact about mummies is that it took around 70 days to preserve the body of a pharaoh, so it wasn't a short process. The Middle Kingdom. This lasted from 1980 BC to 1630 BC. Amenemhet, a vizier from Lower Egypt, took control and became pharaoh. And once pharaoh, he worked to expand Egypt's borders. By expanding the borders, there came other civilizations that he came to rule, and most of the people who were conquered became slaves. And these slaves, however, did have more rights than most. They were allowed to own their own personal items, hold government jobs, and eventually earn their freedom. During the Middle Kingdom, the rise of the middle class came about, and the middle class is made up of craft workers, merchants, scribes, and people who worked in the pharaoh's government. The middle class was also allowed to own their own land, and that's something that only pharaohs had done before. And after 1630 BC, Egypt was conquered by the Hyksos from Western Europe, and Egypt would remain under their rule for the next 100 years. The New Kingdom. This lasted from 1539 BC to 1075 BC. And the reason for the gap from when the Middle Kingdom ended to when the New Kingdom started is because that's the time that the Hyksos ruled, and it's of course not counted in Egyptian dynasties. So in 1539 BC, the Hyksos were expelled, and Egyptians learned how to use war chariots and other weapons, and that's how they actually defeated the Hyksos. And since the Egyptians didn't want to be conquered again, they created their own army, a full-time army. And after its creation, the armies were sent out to conquer more land. Thutmose I got as far as the Euphrates River, which flows through Iraq and Turkey and Syria. In around 1450 BC, in the reign of Thutmose II, ancient Egypt started. It stretched all the way from Syria to Nubia. And Amenhotep IV became pharaoh in 1353 BC, and he changed the religion from worshipping many gods to worshipping only one, the god Aton. He believed so strongly in this religion that he changed his name to Akhenaton, meaning servant of Aton. He may have been devoted to this new religion, but not everyone was. And after his death, the priests changed back to the old religion. The priests also wanted to make sure that something like this wouldn't happen again, so they made a 9-year-old boy pharaoh, and his name was Tutankhamun. He unfortunately had a very early death at 18 years of age, and his death mask is in the picture, and this mask was put over his mummy. By 1075 BC, the New Kingdom ended, and after that, Egypt was never the same. It would survive, but usually only because other people had conquered them. Ancient Egypt would never be the power it was before, though. The Nile. The Nile flooded every year, and this made it a source of life for the Egyptians. Not just because it was a source of water, but also because the Nile would drop off silt, or fine bits of rock, into the soil, making it rich with nutrients and good for farming. The Nile was also a water highway for people and goods to travel along. It allowed the Egyptians to trade and communicate with other civilizations, something they may not have been able to do if it weren't for the Nile. Giver and taker of life. Surprisingly, back in the Paleolithic period, or the Old Stone Age, Egypt was a grassy plain. But due to desertification, or fertile land turning into desert, the land as we know it became desert. The Nile was said to be a giver of life because of its flooding, and when the Nile flooded, it ensured that the Egyptians could farm. But, on the flip side, it could also take life away. If the rains were not heavy enough to make the Nile flood, then Egyptians starved, and if there was too much rain, then the flooding would destroy their crops, and again, they would starve. And for a long time, Egyptians had no way of predicting what the Nile would do. They just had to wait and see what would happen. Why is ancient Egypt important? The main reason Egypt is so important is because ancient Egypt influenced later civilizations. Their innovations helped later civilizations to build upon what the Egyptians already knew. Also, they were one of the longest-lasting civilizations, which is really a testament to their way of life. It continued much longer than any others have. As stated before, Egyptians started discussing subjects such as math, science, and religion before many other civilizations. They created the first written language, and their religion has had influence on other civilizations' religions, especially their monotheistic ruler. Alright, some influences from ancient Egypt that can be seen today. The obelisk, which is an architectural feature that we still see today, An example would be the Washington Monument, and it actually looks very similar to the picture in the lower right-hand corner, which is from Egypt. They made a calendar, and even though we do not use the same calendar, we still break up the year as they did. Some of their folktales are still around today, although most are different from the originals. And we have classes on arithmetic and geometry, and of course we have a written language. Here are some summary questions for you to look at. All of the answers are in this PowerPoint, so they shouldn't be too hard to do. And these are just my references for the information and pictures in my PowerPoint.